The Dog That Follows Death by Jonathan Campbell. It was a scene that she had witnessed time and again, though place and time had lost all meaning for the dog that follows death. The dog stood low behind an ominous skeletal figure that was wreathed in damp black rags. She could not help but do so. Together the dog and the dark figure watched on as some unlucky human grew ripe for the reaping. This particular human was a father, the leader of his pack. The pitiful dog could tell this because she could see the dying pack leader's pup and mate beside him. The human pup fought and wailed. His mother grasped at his head, trying desperately to shield her pup's eyes as the leader of their pack exhaled for the last time. The man had been murdered. The otherworldly dog knew this to be true because the man's killers were also present on the scene. They wore tan camouflage clothing, turtle shell hats of the same color and pattern, and held long, jagged guns. They trained those guns on the mourning mate and pup, barking orders despite the weak pack members' clear and desperate despair. The dog that follows death despised these scenes. Seeing the soldiers kill that man and mistreat his helpless pack drummed up a deep pain in the dog's soul. She responded to this murder the same way she had responded to every injustice she had been forced to witness over the unimaginable expanse of time that she had accompanied death. Part anguish and part anger, the bitch showed her fangs, though no mortal eyes could see them. She would try to bark, but a bone caught low in her throat made the cry too raspy and meek to be heard. As the reaper went reaping, using his power to collect the freshly dead man's soul, the dog used her power to bestow her fangs to the pitiable pack. She always wanted surviving pack members to have her fangs, though she could no more control this power than she could resist her wanton, irresistible pull toward death. Almost instantly her fangs would become theirs. The dog let her fury flow forth from her fiery soul into the mother and pup, and from their mouths grew a pair of ethereal fangs. The ancient bitch would feel satisfaction if the pup and his mother used the power that those invisible fangs gave them to punish the people who had wronged them. Sadly, the dog was never sure that her fangs would be used, and so was never entirely fulfilled. Every time the living unwittingly accepted her ghostly fangs, the landscape of victims and villains would melt away. Justice might have been the dog's name once. It was that or something near to it. There's no telling with a language that had died out many millennia ago. The dog sure as hell didn't remember her name, or which century it was given to her, or any other specific detail about her origin. She cared little for the past, and less for the pain that any memories might bring her. She was and is a simple beast. Beyond deeply ingrained impulses and the occasional blip, Justice's mind only has room for the now, the moment-to-moment that her life has become since she tried to swallow death's ill-tasting fingerbone. Sometimes fragmented memories, more like feelings, of the day she attacked death would involuntarily resurface. These partial recollections produced a reflex in Justice not unlike the salivating of Pavlov's dogs, except her impulse was not to drool and to eat, but to fight and to struggle. She would snarl and snap and bare her fangs, intending to strike anything around her, but all she ever found was death and the dying people that called this awkward pair to each new time and place. At present, death brought them to a rocky beach where a tan young man lay motionless just out of the reach of gently crashing surf. When she saw young men like this, Justice was often reminded of her first master. Again, Justice had no true memories left unrepressed or unforgotten, so these reminders only ever brought about a confusing mix of emotions and reactions. Looking on at this man, lost in the prime of his life, Justice felt the power of festering guilt and pain well up inside of her. Instead of trying to understand these powerful emotions, Justice simply responded to them in anger. It was her hope that someone somewhere would adopt that anger as their own. If she would have been able to remember correctly, or wanted to remember correctly, she would recall that her first master was kind and free-spirited. Unlike her new master, her first had hunted rabbits and deer and boar and many other things that Justice had enjoyed tracking and catching. Together they would earn their kills through fair competition, not because they liked to bring about death, but because each animal that they competed with and bested meant another day of life for them. Now Justice was forced to farm the helpless masses with death. She watched this old bag of cloth and bones endlessly harvest a crop that he did not sow, and so did not earn. The unfairness of Justice's life with death kept a piece of coal constantly burning inside her. From time to time that coal would flare into an inferno, and Justice would want to lash out at her new master, but her congested throat was a constant reminder that recompense would be an ever-distant notion. She had to settle for the righteousness that she helped so many victims of the world achieve. Whether or not she saw those innocent people use her fangs, her wrath, to balance out the scales of life and death, the thought that they might brought her some small solace. It was this solace, along with her lingering anger and pain, that willed Justice to take step after step on her eternal march. And so, once death had taken the young man's soul before them, and Justice had released her anger through a blast of power that reverberated outward to grip all nearby creatures, death took another step into another time and place, and Justice followed. It was a funny thing that finger bone caught in Justice's throat. One might think that it would be hard to ignore, but, as with other things, Justice rarely thought about it now. At first the bone was unbearable, a constant reminder of her past, but like her chipped and missing teeth or her loose and rotting flesh, it had become a part of her. What was stranger about Death's finger bone was the fact that, even as it had slowly become a part of her, it had always remained a part of him. Like Venus to the sun, this finger went where Death went, and like a pathetic rock on the planet's surface, Justice helplessly followed. There were times where Justice would be reminded of the finger. She would once again feel what she had felt the day she had acquired that bone, and would react by unleashing the power stored in those emotions. The loss, the pain, and the sense of weakness she felt as she failed to protect her master from Death's touch would resurface as one. Like a tidal wave, Justice's feelings would wash over the people left alive in Death's wake, bathing them in her fury. She was most often reminded of Death's finger in times when she felt failure's sting again, times like the present. Death brought them to a paved street in a neighborhood that smelled like the pheromones of so many marked and misplaced territories. The buildings in this neighborhood were scarred and ruined like Justice's flesh, while the people who hid between them and inside of them were as terrified and disease-ridden as her maggots and fleas. Death had brought Justice to revolting neighborhoods like this so many times before that they felt like home. On the sidewalk of this godforsaken place, just in front of a rundown church, lay yet another dying man. This one gasped for breath like a hooked fish that would not be thrown back. His blood seeped through his shirt and his shorts, staining the blue bandana in his pocket and pulling on the cracked cement beneath him. Above the dying man knelt another man, one that was quite a bit older. This man wept and prayed, whimpering when the pain became too much to continue his murmurs. There was a moment when he stopped praying to loosen the white collar from around his neck. The old man then reached into his shirt, pulled out a silver chain necklace bearing a silver cross, and pressed that cross onto the young man's bloody chest. He paused like that for a moment, with the cross in his hand and his hand pressed firmly against the dying boy's body, and then he swallowed the painful knot in his throat so that he could continue his prayers. Justice did not understand the prayers, nor did she truly notice them. She was more interested in the older man's wounded whimpering and sorrowful eyes. Justice could tell just by looking into those eyes that he was a creature who had seen a lot of trial and death in his lifetime. For Justice, looking into the old priest's eyes was like looking into a gloomy reflection. The dog knew that if anyone ever needed her help, it was this man in this instance. He deserved the strength to put a stop to whatever evil had hounded him for so long. So Justice bore her fangs and snarled, looking around for a culprit to blame for the murder of someone so young. After finding no one else nearby, she looked back to the old priest. She would bestow her fangs upon him, and while her bizarre power did not need pushing, she would push it into him. Justice would give the desperate man an even greater, longer-lasting dose of wrath to exorcise the many demons that beset him. Justice pressed her hardest, but no fangs appeared on the old man, not even the hint of a protuberance. The longer she looked to the old priest for some sign that her fury had taken, the more bewildered Justice became. Despite her extra effort, the fangs that had grown on so many mortals before refused to appear on this one. She would not be discouraged. Justice summoned the desolation that she had felt across millennia. She called upon the misery that this man had felt in his short time on Earth, and then she released their combined pain and suffering in a shockwave of anger that spread outward for miles. Her fangs seeped into the surrounding neighborhood like the plague, growing on its victims like infectious buboes. So many lost souls and wronged innocents would wear her fangs and share her fury, but the old man before Justice remained untouched by her power. Justice was dismayed to see that he continued weeping and praying as if he felt no anger at all. This had happened before, though it was a rare occurrence. Justice had no way of knowing whether her fangs were rejected by these rare few, or whether she had failed them in some manner. Either way, it always felt like failure in the moment, and while her memory of each particular instance would fade, the feelings of failure would stick with her like Death's fingerbones stuck to her throat. None of these instances would ever be a stronger source of regret than the day that she had failed to save her first master, but they would compound upon that experience for as long as she walked with Death. Past weaknesses formed together inside of her with the new vulnerability she felt at seeing the priest go without her power. However, instead of changing her course of action, her failures only served to accelerate her impetus. Their combined weight made her feel cornered and crazed. The fire inside of her roared as she prepared again to force her hatred of evil into this old man, but just as Justice felt that her rage was about to be released once more, Death took one step forward, and she was pulled with him. Sometime after, or quite possibly during, Justice's failure with the priest, Death and his dogs stepped onto the site of a school building where students ran out onto the lawn and into the street. Pops and bangs and rattles sounded deep from within the school, while the sirens of police cars wailed and chirped outside. A lot of people were in pain, and so in need of Justice's fangs. She obliged the officers in black outfits, the students too sad to realize just how angry they really were, and the teachers in disbelief that this was happening at their school. Death, on the other hand, ignored them all. He flew into the school just as some black armored policemen busted down the door. Justice was dragged along as Death swept the halls clean of the many lingering souls. He gathered so many souls on his path through the school that Justice almost started to believe that he would be satiated. But then the scene faded and transformed as a new soul beckoned the pair away. One more step revealed a woman in her hospital bed. After a high-pitched ringing and a scythe through the air, Death's task was complete. Justice was somewhat contented to see a fresh pair of fangs appear on some medical workers and tired pack members at the dying woman's bedside. They would use Justice's power to lash out at one another until they found the right offender to blame and punish for the ill woman's passing. Yet another step showed repulsing smoke and flames enveloping an oil rig in the middle of a salty blue gulf. Death's curved blade cut through it all to siphon souls from their physical forms. Justice's insubstantial fangs then grew on mortals near and far. Again and again, place to place, death to death, it was a series of recurring nightmares that did not hint at a conclusion. What caused it all? The violence, the pain and suffering, the death. Justice did not know, nor did she take the time to ponder these questions. She is as thoughtless and unreflective as one would expect a prehistoric brain-rotted canine to be, and even more so. Justice had become Death's perpetual victim, but she refused to play the part. She unwittingly made it her goal to chip away at Death's hold on the living by giving others the strength to succeed where she had failed so long ago. She gave them the power to strike back when struck by Death so that they would not have to be victims like her. Much has been said of Justice's feeble mind, but her memory did have its rare moments. There were glimmers of recollections here and there when one victim or landscape resembled another. This happened most often when Death arrived at a scene a little early in anticipation of a large number of souls. Justice had more time in these instances to recognize the props, the set, and the people that would perform on Death's stage. Set to perform momentarily was a tan young man who at one instant stirred up feelings she had for her first master. At a second glance reminded her of a young pup whose father had been shot by menacing soldiers, and then, after further examination, of no one in particular at all. Justice noticed that the young man wore a black shroud about his head and body to protect him from the heat and sand, but she also saw a different shroud enveloping him. This shroud, invisible to most, was the spiritual shroud of a wounded soul. Like atmosphere to a planet, this shroud trapped certain things in as it repelled others. This young man's shroud locked in pain and anger while blocking out the unwanted concern for people around him. It was heavy in its unnoticed existence. Justice knew none of this in her almost intentional ignorance of such things. All she saw was a young man with a haze about him and, if her eyes did not deceive her, a pair of ethereal fangs overhanging his visage. These fangs and the fury stored inside them were obviously of her creation, though Justice did not recognize them as such. To her, those fangs were like any creature's fangs. They served as a sign of warning for any and all who might attract the ire of such an empowered individual. Justice watched as the young man marched through a market smelling of smoked meats, strange creatures, and disregarded dung. She watched, wondering why Death allowed her to do so for so long, as the young man entered a building with meaningless words engraved in a placard hung over the door. She watched for another moment, and then looked at Death to discover that he was watching her, if watching was the true purpose of those ebon sockets. Death looked at his bitch for a moment longer, and then looked toward the building. Before Justice could turn back to look at the building, it pulsed and exploded in a sudden burst of rubble and sand. The blast shook the ground and left a ringing in Justice's decaying yet well-tuned ears. The destruction, the undeserved taking of so many innocent lives, and even the ringing in her ears caused Justice to bare her teeth and lower her chest in preparation to pounce. Once she remembered where she was and what she was, she forgot everything else. Death would not forget to play his part, so she should not forget to play hers. There would be so many in need of Justice's fangs at this place and time, so many for whom the scales were now imbalanced, that Justice would have to push that involuntary impulse with all of her might and fury. She would have to release all of that negative energy that she had collected over her miserable existence to ensure that no victim would go unsupported and that no perpetrator would go unpunished. And so she did. Justice snapped and frothed and let loose a subdued and screeching howl along with her unending rage. Her frenzied, intangible wrath filled the air around her and then exploded outward in a surge of force 100 times more potent than the one that had demolished this market corner. It rippled free from her soul and attached itself to every living thing that would subconsciously acquiesce. In the wake of her power, Justice's fangs began to sprout like furious seedlings across the marketplace. Her fangs grew on the many market-goers, some who were injured, some luckily intact, and some who were left behind by their recently fallen packmates. Then fangs grew on sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, people young and old from the nearby villages and cities, and even to others across the sea. Fangs spread to the mouths of the religious and the non-believers, to the evil and the good, to the criminal and the lawful alike. Fangs spread to the men who helped plan this attack, and to the tan camouflage soldiers who rolled in on the scene too late to do anything but grow Justice's fangs. Finally, her fangs spread to the suit-wearing politicians who claimed to understand it all, and to a multitude of others who did not know why they felt so angry, but felt it all the same. After the dust had settled and the souls had been collected, Death moved on from this marketplace just as he had arrived. The dog, already forgetting most of what she had seen, followed in his wake.